Hi, everyone. Welcome to this fireside chat and presentation and discussion Aaron Tran from Workflow 86 is giving us. We started this with the ex-Google Xoogler community, decided to expand it to key related communities, and thought we'll actually end the week here on the Pacific side, this side of the Pacific, I should say, in APAC, with a conversation with Aaron, who's usually based in San Francisco, but he's back in Australia right now. Um, Aaron and I went to the same high school in Sydney and got to know him better over the pandemic. And over the past couple of years, he's been doing some amazing things, having gone to Y Combinator's Winter 2022 batch. And through that, as well as another investor of his, has gotten to know OpenAI over the past few months in a deeper way. And so when OpenAI's DevDay happened earlier this week, we were discussing how we could help the community as well as others learn more about what are the implications of their releases, whether it's on technology, businesses, startups. And so that's why we have this conversation with him. A bit more about Aaron. Aaron was a management consultant to start with. After realizing there was more ways that management consultants could actually be more efficient and effective, he decided to explore no-code solutions with starting a company that turned into Workflow 86, that he now runs, which is based in the Bay Area, as well as his operations in Sydney, Australia. Aaron, thanks so much for accepting this invitation and educating all of us of what happened with OpenAI's announcements this week. Please share more about yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks, Chris, for organizing this. Definitely, an incredibly exciting week to be in AI. I think, it's been an exciting year. And I think for a lot of us sort of building in this space, just the pace of progress, the pace at which things have changed, have had massive implications, for some good, for some bad. I think for us, it's been incredibly, beneficial. But yeah, very excited to chat with everyone, discuss some of what we've seen in terms of the implication. We've really spent the last couple of days just very, very intensively experimenting with everything that was just released, Vision, GPT-4 Turbo, etc. And can share some of the experiences or our initial findings in relation to that as well. So as a bit more background, like Chris mentioned, I'm the founder of Workflow 86. We are essentially building an AI-first workflow automation platform. So essentially, we're using AI to discover, design, and then build out complex business processes completely autonomously. So what we're really aiming for here is to reimagine how a lot of business process or workflow automation software is done. Right now, there's a big sort of focus on no code, low code. And really sort of our journey into AI happened late last year when we got early access to GPT-4. And we saw that, it was actually very much possible for AI to, handle a lot of this complex, discovery, design, and build process that prior to that was not possible. So we've been on this journey for the last 9 months or so and really gotten deep into, the existing capabilities of the technology, its limitations, developing a lot of new and interesting techniques on how to, squeeze as much performance out of whatever models are available at the moment. So also very, very excited to, share a bit more about their journey as well. So I'll start with a high-level summary about sort of what was announced. Then I'll dive into, in particular, some of the more particular announcements. I'm going to focus mainly on the API and dev announcements versus the GPT side, though I'll touch on those a little bit. And then I'll come back out and talk about, I think, some of the bigger picture implications of what was announced. And that will be sort of contextualized, not just in terms of what was announced, this week, but also the trends that we can see in terms of, what, OpenAI has been announcing this year, but also the previous year as well. So the trend in terms of like, where will things likely be in 6 to 12 months and the implications of that. So as a high level summary, I guess the major things that we saw were, the announcement of GPT-4 Turbo. This is a new version of GPT-4. It's got a larger context, it's faster, it's got vision capability. And I'll dive in a little bit more about our experimentation into that. But that was very exciting in terms of just, there'd been a lot of people building on GPT-4. And I think what OpenAI did when they announced GPT-4 Turbo was actually address probably most of the major issues that a lot of developers or founders building the space had. a lot of things around latency, a lot of things around the limited context window, a lot of things around the pricing as well. More so on the ChatGPT side, we saw the introduction of personalized GPTs. I think where that's quite interesting is, again, the implications on all the startups who are building this, this product essentially, in this idea of you got GPT or you got the API, and now you want to create a personalized GPT with access to its own files, its own prompts, etc. And how quickly, I guess, OpenAI has essentially subsumed that into its core product. We got the announcement of the GPT store, which is also quite interesting. I think that this was something which people kind of saw earlier in March/April, May, when sort of GPT did the whole plugins concept. Plugins, I don't think was as successful as a lot of people initially thought. And so it will be interesting to see how the GPT store actually sort of plays out over the next couple of months. Back to the API side, and particularly interesting for anyone who is looking into sort of this whole space of agents, is the Assistance API. So again, it's essentially quite a fundamentally different, I think, API for OpenAI. It's whilst a lot of the existing APIs were, really focused around completions or chat, that is like, the output is like a message back or content back. With the Assistance API, you're actually able to, get the API to output, generate files. It can run code, it can retrieve files from its built-in file library. And so that is quite interesting as well, I think, on a couple of levels, not only in terms of the capability it adds, but just in terms of, a lot of people over the last 3 to 6 months had been trying to build this capability in-house. And again, quite interesting that a lot of that capability has essentially been subsumed into OpenAI's, API product. There's some stuff around DALL-E 3, the audio API. There was some announcements around Copyright Shield, which I won't go into too much. And then again, some stuff around, custom models and this sort of professional services kind of offering where they'll help you essentially train your own version of GPT-4. But I think that's quite interesting in terms of, I think the estimated amount for that is, $2 to $3 million. So implications of that in terms of like, fine tuning, or other companies that have sort of built businesses around fine tuning models. So yeah, that's just a very, very quick overview of what was announced this week. And now I'm just going to dive into some of the more interesting things. So I think for us, the most interesting one was GPT-4 Turbo with the 128K context. So earlier this year, we got early access to GPT-4, experimented around with that. That really sort of proved out, the concept of the more advanced capabilities around GPT-4 versus the previous models, and made a lot of things more possible. One of the things that sort of we quickly ran into in terms of problems is the context window. So GPT-4 allows about, I think it's 8,000 tokens. And again, for our particular application, so we use AI essentially to take natural language, or, now, for example, images, and then essentially translate that into a fully built out business process. So you could, for example, upload a diagram or a Miro board of your onboarding process, and our AI essentially builds out the entire thing, every single step, every single component, configures everything. And so at the end of, just a couple of minutes, you essentially have a fully built out business process. In order to achieve that, that's quite a complex task. And also, in our experience, performs, the only way we got it to, perform very well was to actually have quite a complex and sophisticated prompting strategy. And so we have sort of been interested in sort of how the context window grows. We got access to GPT-4 32K. So that, is about, 4 times larger than the default GPT-4. Which did solve a lot of our problems, still had the same capability as the core GPT-4, but it was very expensive. And so I think in our experience, we came across this dilemma of GPT-4 was great, didn't have enough context. GPT-4 32K had the context, but it was just very expensive. And so when GPT-4 Turbo was announced this week, it was sort of very exciting for us, because essentially a few of them those 2 major issues were essentially eliminated. So with GPT-4, you have a model that is certainly in our experience, I think one of the most immediate things we noticed is it's a lot faster. So when we ran it through our suite of tests, on average, GPT-4 took about 28 seconds to return our output, and GPT-4 Turbo returns it in about 8 to 10 seconds. So for us, we saw, a 2-3x improvement in terms of speed, much lower latency, which was fantastic. The other major thing, like I mentioned, was that it was cheaper. It's 2 to 3 times cheaper compared to GPT-4, significantly cheaper than GPT-32K, which I think is also quite interesting as well. It will be interesting to sort of where does GPT-32K sit now that, there is GPT-4 Turbo, it's faster, it's got, 4 times the context. And so, yeah, I think that will be quite interesting in terms of how that model sort of plays out. There is a question around, is it smarter? Is it better? So I think during the announcement, Sam said that it's better at following instructions. In our initial testing, simply swapping from GPT-4 to GPT-4 Turbo actually resulted in poorer outputs. And again, this is very specific to our use case. We're asking GPT to do quite a complex task, which is, to break down a whole bunch of user intent in terms of what kind of business process they want to build, what kind of goals or requirements they need that process to accomplish, and then actually build out that entire workflow for them. So when we ran these experiments, we found that there was actually a decrease in the quality of the output, and we actually had to do some minor adjustments of our existing prompts to get GPT-4 Turbo to perform at the same level as GPT-4, the older version of GPT-4. That is on sort of the prompting side. More fundamentally, so in our particular use case, for example, we actually have to architect the way in which we interact with GPT-4 in quite a structured way, i.e. we can't just do it in one step. We actually break it into multiple steps. And that is mainly to, take a very sort of complex problem, break it into smaller parts, and then actually get quite an accurate or performant output at the end. I was quite interested in seeing whether, GPT-4 Turbo would be able to handle that in fewer steps or without those steps at all. And I think at a fundamental level, the answer is no. So I would say that the improvements in terms of, its ability to listen to instructions is more incremental than orders of magnitude. So for, in our particular use case, we still need to perform that multi-step chain in order to get the quality of prompts that we had before. GPT-4 does not eliminate sort of more fundamental decisions or more fundamental design patterns in terms of how you use the AI. But it is, again, faster, it's cheaper. And I think maybe slightly better at following instructions, but not to the extent that, you could fundamentally, or in our case, that we could fundamentally go from a 2 or 3 step process to just a 1-step process. The other interesting thing around this is, again, the large context window. So again, for most people who had access to GPT-4, they had the 8K model. Some people had the 32K model. The 32K model, again, I think for most use cases, particularly for our use case, was fine. Though in some of the features that we're rolling out, we were actually beginning to start to hit the 32K token limit. So when 128K came out, that was fantastic. There is a big caveat here, and I think some people have already begun to do some experimentation here. And it's really around this question of, do bigger context windows actually matter at all? There was a paper that came out early in this year. It was called Lost in the Middle, How Language Models Use Long Context. And the overall conclusion out of that was, you can give the AI very, very long context, but it definitely has a pattern in terms of what it listens to and what it does not listen to. So as the title suggests, what the researchers found was that, the AI will tend to listen to, let's say, the first 20% and then the final 20%. But whatever's in that middle 60% often gets ignored or not followed very well. And someone did an initial experimentation with this on Twitter as well. And I think they came to the same conclusions. The first 10% works very well, the middle sort of 50% not very well, and then the last 20, 30%, again, it will listen to quite well as well. So there's sort of this interesting sort of debate around, do we actually need models that can do or have longer context, or do we need models that can actually just listen to whatever context they get a lot better? So yeah, that was what we found as we rolled out GPT-4 Turbo in our initial experimentation. For us, I think once the actual GPT-4 Turbo gets released out into, from right now, you have the preview API. I think once the production API comes out, we will definitely be switching across to that. But it wasn't just as easy as, changing it from GPT-4 to GPT-4 1106. There was some work that we needed to do. We needed to rerun all our tests, and then we needed to adjust it slightly as well. Fundamentally, the architecture of how we actually use the AI has not changed in terms of we still need a multi-step process, but it's fantastic that it's cheaper, it's faster, and it's got a larger context window. Though again, with the caveat of, depending on your particular use case, I think the limitations around what parts of that, the inputs that you give that the AI actually listens to still needs to be sort of taken into consideration. Next thing I think that,
Aaron, should we cover some of the questions that have come in? I think the first
yeah, sure.
Very relevant. Erica, do you want to unmute and ask your question, Erica?
Hey guys, good morning. Hey, thanks Aaron for the sharing. Basically, the question from me, I'm working on the AI business process and chatbot as my main job. So my question is, you mentioned your product is to build out a business process through the documents, right? Documents or the information from the organization to map out the business process. Just wondering, the business process output is sort of like auto-linked to the system, like data and logic, stuff like that, or is more like business process map, which we usually collaborate with different team to map it out for confirmation, and later we'll see how to implement from operation, business, and technology perspective. Just wondering how does your product fit into a larger organization like my company?
Yeah, so we actually do both. So the AI can actually help translate, documents, unstructured data into a mapped out business flow, but its core intent is actually to build out a functioning, business process using the built-in modules that we have. So our product has sort of all the core building blocks that you need for a business workflow: forms, tasks, API requests, the ability to run code, the ability to send emails, etc. So really what we found in terms of, using AI is we can use AI to actually discover the process, flesh out the process, design the process as a diagram, and then very easily to then transition that diagram or that flow chart into an actual functional business process. And that is built into Workflow 86. So all the parts and components can run inside of Workflow 86 because, again, we have our own built-in databases, our own built-in components that can handle the steps of that business process. But it can also integrate with external applications as well, using things like webhooks or the API components, etc. So that's what we do, I guess, in how we're doing AI. And it's quite interesting in the sense that we found that it is quite important to be able to allow the AI to handle both, as in not only to diagram out the business process, but also to actually use that as the basis to build it. Because I think, as you'll probably, in your experience, business process in large organizations, they often face the problem they actually don't know what the process looks like, or they haven't mapped it out in the first place. So about 6 months ago, we began integrating this capability of, okay, rather than just jumping into the building of the process, it can actually help map out that process first. And then once that's been sort of clarified, it can then take essentially a screenshot of that process and then turn it into the build. So yeah, we handle the discovery, design, and then actually the build itself as well. So it's quite an interesting problem and quite a complex problem in terms of how you apply AI.
Understand. I can definitely resonate some of the pain points you mentioned earlier, because I'm working on the internal processes and from the chatbot and customer journey perspective, you need to map out the business process. You need to sort out the business process and diagram first, right? And confirmation, and also do the implementation from either business as well as the technology point of view, which could be a time-consuming task at times. So
Yeah.
really look forward to the product or the prototype we already have. I think it will be a very interesting discovery.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, I think the way we think about it is with the advancements sort of that we saw 9 months ago, it's very much possible for AI to play the role of a business analyst and a systems engineer, and for it to seamlessly transition from how do I map out the process, align that with the business requirements, and then go straight into the build. So yeah, it's definitely a very interesting space.
Let's go to
there's a question around
Aninda, you're not
Yeah, I can ask my question. So why should developers bet on OpenAI and proprietary tech versus like open source Llama? Like I guess it's kind of like Unix versus Linux, or yeah, I mean, also there's probably the other way around is iOS versus Android, but it's not quite clear who won in that one either.
Yeah, it is an interesting question. So again, imagine your investors won't hear your answer. So full disclosure, our early investors were also early investors in OpenAI. That's how we got access to a lot of stuff a little bit ahead of everyone else. They were very sort of big on us being able to experiment with it. We have experimented with open source models. And again, a lot of this is caveated against our particular use case, but for us, we could never get open source models to perform as well as GPT-4. So I think that GPT-4 as of now is still, state of the art. It is, I think, the most sophisticated model that's available. Early this year, when we did this experimentation, a lot of that was motivated by sort of three things. Like, could we get an open source model to perform better than GPT-4? And I think the answer has predominantly been no. Like, no open source model has actually been able to match GPT-4, at least as, maybe in very particular and very specialized applications, but not at, a general level as a model. We're also looking at in terms of price. Obviously, if you host your own model, there's a significant pricing advantage, and then also around latency. So again, if you host your own model, you could probably get the outputs and decrease the latency significantly. And ultimately, we spent a couple of weeks doing it, and I think this has also been a trend which we've seen in the last 3-4 months, is a lot of people going from, okay, I can do this with GPT-4, but it's too expensive, it's too slow, so I'm going to try and develop our own open source model, fine tune it in order to achieve the same thing. In my experience, and again, like this was our experience as well, and talking to other founders who've done that, for the most part, if GPT-4 was 98% performant, I think most people have been able to get it, an open source fine-tuned model to 90 to 95%, but it was never as performant as GPT-4 as a whole. And again, depending on your particular use case, maybe 95% versus 98% performant isn't that big of a deal, and that trade-off is something that you can accept. But yeah, I think for us right now, it's the most performant, it's the most sophisticated, so it just makes sense for us to stay on GPT-4. Not to say that we won't explore sort of open source models in the future, but I think this question is very, very use case specific, and I think that's probably the trend across all of this, is that it really depends on how you're using AI. If you're using AI for content generation, which is a relatively straightforward task, again, depending on what it's particularly used for, probably open source models can get you to where you need to go. If it's something quite complex, something requires what you could call aspects of planning or reasoning, then again, it might be a bit more difficult to get open source to the level that you want it to get. Like another example would be early in the year, we explored quite a few of the open source models that had multimodal capabilities. So, the ability to understand images. And again, with the announcement that came out with, GPT-4 having that vision capability built in, I think if we went down that road, it would have just been, a lot of wasted effort, I think. And I think that's quite an interesting implication, again, around, the announcement the last week, is that question of, do you go in-house? Do you go open source? Or do you kind of bet on, OpenAI always having the best model available, and that over time it will get faster and cheaper as well. So I can't say that there's a definitive answer for whether you go open source or OpenAI. For us, for our particular use case, going with OpenAI has been the I think the best choice. Yeah.
Aninda, does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's a really good answer. Thanks.
Great. Aaron, let's go to a couple more questions, Aaron, before we go back to the content you've prepared, if you don't mind. I'll read.
Sure.
What has your experience been with hybrid approaches of mixing different LLMs? Is it a viable approach to improve product unit economics? I can ask live as one of us.
Yeah, absolutely. So we do mix different models. I guess I'll caveat with the sense that the hardest task that we ask GPT to do is, again, to essentially, write the pseudocode for a complex business process. And that we can only do with GPT-4. But we do mix a number of, some of the more simple GPT models, 3.5, 3.5 Turbo, and then also experimenting with some open source models as well. So I think mixing models definitely is something which I've seen a lot of founders, do. And because it just doesn't make sense to use, the most powerful, most expensive, and most sophisticated model for every single task. So, an example might be, what model do you use to summarize the content of a particular module or component in order to auto-generate a description for it? That does not need GPT-4. Typically, GPT 3.5 or one of the open source models can do that quite well. So, hybrid approach to different LLMs, I think, definitely something I've seen a lot. And it really is because each LLM has its own pluses and minuses, its trade-offs in terms of price, latency. And again, it's like, do you need a Ferrari to drive to the supermarket? GPT-4 is that Ferrari essentially. And the answer a lot of the times is, you don't need the biggest, the best, the most expensive to do a lot of simpler tasks.
Thank you. Nicholas's question: how much advantage do you think comes from more specialized, fine-tuned models compared to just blanket using GPT-4 128K tokens?
Yeah, I think where this will be quite interesting. So we have experimented with fine-tuning in our experience. And again, I think we're still experimenting with it. I think there's definitely potential for fine-tuned models to perform, better than sort of more general models. There's a lot of trial and error involved with that. And so I think a lot of it just has to do, again, with your particular use case. If you have the data, if you have, the massive amounts of training data that you can use to actually fine tune, I think the only way in which you can answer that question is, fine tune it and then essentially run two tests in parallel. Does the fine tune model perform better? Does it perform worse? In our experience so far, with our experimentation with fine tuning, it's actually performed worse. And that could just be a result of, a lot of the data that we're giving it is overtraining the model. And so I think and again, this is in particular in relation to how we use AI in one aspect of our product. I think, again, you may well come to, coming back to the previous point, some tasks will perform better with a fine-tuned model, others will perform better with the more general model. And you may need to mix that up, in a single action or request that the user might need to perform in order to actually get the result that you actually want. So I think that's what we've found with fine-tuning.
Great. So Aaron, why don't you continue with your prepared remarks, and folks, feel free to keep typing up questions and we can take small breaks and ask those questions. Go for it, Aaron.
Yep. So the next really interesting thing was the assistance API. And again, this is for anyone sort of who's been looking at the space, this is the whole idea of agents. And I think the way you can describe agents is it's AI that can go out and, basically set out tasks that it will perform rather than just giving you an outputs outright. So the whole idea is you can ask the AI, okay, I want to achieve X. And rather than just giving you, the text to achieve X, it'll actually go out and say, in order to achieve X, I will do A, B, C. And then it actually goes out, executes A, B, C. There's been a lot of sort of chatter and sort of news happening in this space. It's been something that's been around for a while. I think that it's definitely probably the most interesting part of how, large language models can be used. But I don't think anyone has really achieved a truly performant agent at this point. So, early this year, you might have seen some early sort of open source experiments with like Baby GPT and then Auto GPT, et cetera. And I think the universal experience there was like you could give it a task and it would plan it out and execute those steps, but oftentimes it would go into a loop or would go onto like these massive tangents. The other important aspect of agents is, again, that they typically have access to tools. So what that means is an agent can say, okay, in order to achieve this, I will need to write code and then run that code and then, process the output of that code that I ran in order to go to the next step. I definitely think that that's sort of that seems to be quite the important trend here, is that the way you get agents performant is that you give them access to tools, and a lot of their performance depends on how well they can actually manipulate, use, understand those tools. So with the Assistance API, essentially you have an API that can, rather than just give a text output or a chat message back, can actually do things like, generate files, write the code to generate the file, and then return, a URL to that file. So an example might be you can create an assistant that, you give it a bunch of context about a presentation that you need to do, and you say, okay, I want you to turn this into a PowerPoint presentation. And it can actually, rather than saying, okay, this is what I think the PowerPoint presentation looks like in a giant chunk of text, it will actually generate the PowerPoint file for you and, return that as the URL. So I think that's, the really interesting thing here, beyond the fact that this is quite a different way, or, quite a different product from a lot of OpenAI's core APIs, the chat and completions API in particular, is really that, for the last, 3-4 months, a lot of people had spent time trying to build these agents with the ability to, retrieve information from uploaded files using, RAG. They've spent a lot of time trying to build that in-house. And now essentially, it's available as an API. It's probably, again, depending on the use case, it probably does perform better than anything built in-house. And again, there's this theme of decisions made 3 to 4 months ago having these sort of implications now, as a lot of this technology potentially gets eaten up by OpenAI itself. So the Assistance API, I think, is, we've done some initial experimentation with it. It's definitely quite interesting. I don't think I've come anywhere near to sort of realizing, its full potential, what can be built out of it. But it is quite a fundamental, I think, change in terms of the API, how we interact with the OpenAI API. Because no longer is it just, okay, here is a text output. Again, it can actually go out, write code, run code, generate files. It can retrieve files from the built-in file library that OpenAI has introduced with the Assistance API. So it is quite interesting. There's a trend here, I think, that is also quite interesting, which I'll talk to later as sort of I come back to the bigger picture here, which is really around, I think a lot of people early this year thought that OpenAI would, kind of focus on being sort of selling the picks and shovels versus actually building actual, end-to-end products. And I think the trend has generally proven that to be, quite false. I think that OpenAI is shipping a lot of stuff that, in itself could be a fully built out product, and not just, an API that gets integrated into, other people's products. So I think that's also quite interesting as well. I guess the final major thing that I'll touch on, I think the final major highlight for us was the pricing updates. So, GPT-4 Turbo is 2 to 3x cheaper than GPT-4. And that's pretty massive. It's massive in terms of, again, one of the main complaints that a lot of people had was that GPT-4 was expensive, GPT-4 32K, even, way more expensive. And now you have an option that, not only is cheaper, it's faster, and it's got a bigger context window. So I think that in itself just unlocks a lot of other use cases or applications. I will say on this is that there's a very definite trend here that I think we can kind of bet on. And it's something that Sam Altman mentioned at a couple of months ago at a YC alumni event. But it's also sort of quite evident in their sort of history as well. So last year around August 2022, all their APIs got 66% cheaper. And now, earlier this year as well, I think around about the time they announced GPT-4, GPT 3.5 got cheaper as well. And now we're seeing it getting cheaper again. So I think one of the longer term things that you can definitely sort of see is that, these models will get cheaper, they will get faster. There's still a question mark on, do they get smarter or how much smarter they get from, every 3 to 6 months. But it is one of those things which, maybe you want to think about how much you actually optimize for cost in terms of, do you pick open source or OpenAI? Do you build your own? Do you try and, make 3.5 performant, or do you just kind of build on 4 on the assumption that 4 will, get cheaper over time? So I think that's quite interesting in terms of like a general longer term trend. Things will get cheaper, things will get faster. Yep.
Yeah. Aaron, would you like to grab a water while I read the next question out?
Yeah, sure.
Regarding the implications of making human-machine interfaces socially sensitive going forward, could you elaborate on how threading and memory interact with the context window, now 128K? For instance, the open source starter kit for Yoko's AI companions, and later in AI Town, memory was emulated via summarization. So it's a really long question to hear, Randeep. So I think Aaron's probably taking a read himself. I'm not sure whether there's a quick answer here that you have insights that you can provide, Aaron.
I get the technical aspect of the problem of, summarizing sort of previous threads. I'm not sure what you mean by the social applications of these large models. Do you mean like for a particular use case or a particular problem to solve? Yeah.
Yeah, so this is in the context of agents. So this came out of the May Stanford project, the paper that was published in May, where they simulated, basically GPTs against other GPTs. And now that OpenAI has made that part of its API to configure these agents and implement them, instantiate them, it kind of opens the floodgates for all kinds of applications to basically use simulated agents, which exhibit simulated human social behavior, like they talk to each other, design. Obviously they're not having any of the concept space; it's just still a glorified autocomplete. But the implications become like, okay, how do human beings practice social skills, for example, with a virtual conference room of people, with 3 highly opinionated people in a conference table with different opinions arguing in a meeting? How do you make progress in that meeting? And people get to practice in these environments. So that's something I'm kind of excited about. But I worry that with things like, these agents forgetting. So the question is, with lost in the middle, do they start forgetting stuff that we talked about before with them? And do they start to have character flaws where, somebody is supposed to be, let's say, behaving a certain way, but then that past conversation is lost at some point through the summarization and lost in the middle, to the point where they behave as if they completely didn't have this conversation with you in the past, right? So that's basically where the question is going. Is that going to be a limitation of these social agents going forward, implemented this way?
Yeah, so it is I guess slightly different to sort of the problem that we face with larger contexts. For us, the loss in the middle problem is always, we give the AI a set of instructions that it has to follow. And if it does not follow those instructions, it may produce, a poorer output. I think that, yes, it's one of those problems which is evident in a lot of these tests and experimentation with, as the conversation gets larger, the AI does potentially forget more and more about, what it actually, the entire history of the conversation itself. So like you said, people have tried techniques in terms of like, rather than giving it a massive context, can I summarize as much of the previous context as I can to a smaller chunk of information that it will likely comprehend more? But yeah, it is, I guess the gist of it is, yes, it is an issue. And I don't think anyone has really sort of figured out how you solve it, given the current behaviors of the existing models at the moment. Summarization is one way in which people have tried it. But again, summarization itself has its own cons. There's always the possibility that in the process of summarizing the previous history, certain details or information is lost. And in turn, again, that changes the behavior of the AI itself. So yeah, it is one of those interesting questions around, do we need models that have more context, or do we actually need a model that solves this more fundamental problem of, the information getting lost in the middle? Yeah.
Hey, thanks.
Maybe one more from TR, and then we'll go back to your prepared remarks, Aaron. Regarding the loss in the middle phenomenon, I was under the impression that this was empirically evident with end-shot prompting, where head-tail examples, but demonstrably weighted more. So he's asking for evidence in terms of the problems more generic than that.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, I'll caveat by saying that, you know, I'm not an AI researcher. So in terms of the actual fundamental root cause about why AI models behave in this way, I won't be able to answer that. But evidence. Yeah, so I guess the caveat to that is I'm not sure whether it's a more general model with a general issue with how the models are designed or behaved, or how they're architected. But I think generally what we've found is that, again, even as these models progress, this issue has persisted, and the way in which it has been most relevant for us, as well as other sort of founders building the space, is, again, how do you actually overcome this issue of, you know, anything that you put in the middle essentially not getting listened to. For us, we had to develop techniques around actually trying to split the task into multiple steps, like I mentioned before, so that rather than, you know, essentially giving the AI multiple opportunities to digest as much as it could in those two tail ends of the information we give it, versus like relying on a massive context and potentially it missing out on a lot more information in the middle. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, let's go back to your prepared questions, remarks. Sorry, Aaron.
Yeah, so I was just talking about pricing. Again, I think the other interesting thing about the pricing is not just that GPT-4 is cheaper and faster, but I think it's also quite important that GPT 3.5 also got cheaper as well. So the new default model, GPT 3.5, the 16K model, I think they said it's about 2 to 3 times cheaper than the previous 16K model. And I think the implication here, again, coming back to, I guess, the previous point where you're sort of mixing a variety of different models to achieve a certain task, is there's potentially smaller, simpler tasks or applications for AI that, you know, you can now use GPT 3.5 for, because it is, you know, quite, I guess, almost dirt cheap. And the outputs of that could actually contribute to enhanced performance of the more sophisticated model. So an example for us is being able to accurately describe what a particular step in a workflow does is quite important, because that is then passed to the GPT-4 at the higher level in order to actually build it out. Being able to just use it to, you know, output a better summary, or to, you know, auto name variables within that component better than, you know, how the user might have named it, in turn contributes to the better performance of the high level model. So I think that's one of the implications that's also quite interesting in terms of, yes, you get new models, the new models are cheaper, but also the existing older models get a lot cheaper as well. So, and that in turn also opens up a variety of applications as well. So yeah, as I guess the final part, I'll just be moving back to, I guess, a little bit more about the bigger picture. So I think one of the interesting things is, again, this whole idea that OpenAI would just be a picks and shovel company has largely been proven, you know, false. I think that they're shipping a lot of product, they're shipping a lot of features, and a lot of those features potentially are entire products in themselves. And for a lot of founders, I think one of the sort of the interesting things is, again, like the decisions you made 3 to 6 months ago are having massive implications now. So a lot of resources, you know, invested into developing in-house RAG, a lot of resources into developing, you know, open source models or techniques to get, you know, faster, cheaper. Is that relevant today, as, you know, OpenAI basically gives you everything you need faster and cheaper? Again, no answer to that. I guess a lot of that, again, just depends on your particular use case. But I do think it's quite interesting in terms of, you know, I guess the need to think very carefully or deeply about what are you betting on in terms of the decisions you make now? Are you betting on, you know, the models getting cheaper and faster, or are you betting on like what the models can do right now, how expensive they are right now, how fast they are right now? Again, I think the trend has just been that they'll get faster, they'll get cheaper, and they'll probably get incrementally smarter as well. I mean, I guess the other sort of...
Yeah, on that point, Aaron, we had this discussion prepping for this call. How would you recommend startup founders decide which route to take, right? Because it may not be clear sometimes. And what do you think will happen?
Yeah, I think so I'll caveat this by saying like a lot of my thinking on this has sort of been influenced, I guess, by our investors in this space, a lot of founders that we're talking in this space. Again, like anyone who follows YC knows that YC has done a whole bunch of investments in AI. It's very interesting to see how those play out as well. I think if you're a startup founder right now, I think it's probably the most exciting time in the sense that with AI, I think a lot of existing software categories can now be reinvented to be AI first. And what I mean by that is, you know, when you look at sort of these pivotal moments in software, there have been moments where existing categories had to be completely reinvented because the fundamental technology or the primitives changed. So, you know, you had software and then you had internet, and then you had to reinvent or reimagine what software looked like, you know, in an age of widespread internet access. I think the other interesting sort of parallel might be, you know, with cloud, right? You had CRMs before cloud, and the massive company that you see, Salesforce, now is because they redefined what does CRM mean with the introduction of cloud. I think one of the other parallels which people have seen is in terms of like mobile, right? You had software that was, you know, not possible before, you know, widespread, you know, smartphone and mobile adoption. And then you had products like Uber and Instagram, which were only really made possible with that change in the fundamentals or the change in the primitives of that software itself. So I think we're seeing the same moment now in terms of AI. I think there's definitely an opportunity to sort of, you know, rethink, like, what does an AI first CRM look like? I don't think it will look like Salesforce. I think, and this is also, I think, one of the interesting things about like the whole thing about who really wins from AI. Is it the incumbents or is it the startups? I think one of the problems that the incumbents have, and, you know, we've had 6 to 9 months of incumbents trying to bring in AI into their, you know, their core products. I think one of the problems which they've had is if you've spent the last 10, 20 years building your software on a certain set of assumptions or principles about, you know, how it's going to be used, trying to integrate AI into that is potentially actually quite difficult. And what I mean by that is I think you know, we can probably say that the trend for the last 20 years in terms of software has been around, you know, you build software to make it as easy as possible for a human to use. So there's a really big focus around, you know, human UI UX, right? I think one of the interesting ideas that's emerging is like, what does software look like if, you know, it's designed not for humans to be the first users or the primary users, but actually AI to be the primary user? What does AI, you know, UX, UI look like? And in the workflow automation space, it is quite interesting because, you know, if you try and approach that problem using sort of the existing sort of technologies, you kind of either go down sort of robotic process automation or, you know, integrations focused integrations, both of which have their pluses and minuses. So I think if you're a startup founder right now, for me at least, I think it's the most interesting thing is, yeah, like, what does, you know, AI first in an existing software category look like? Because I think it does look very different. And I think that is where, you know, if you're building from the ground up again, that's where you can make design decisions that, you know, give you a significant advantage as AI gets better, as AI gets faster, as it gets cheaper, as it gets smarter, etc. So yeah, I think that's my general point. I think like on the flip side of that, the thing not to do, and I think there's been a lot of sort of talk about, you know, every time OpenAI has one of these days, a whole bunch of startups get killed off. And I think that's true. Like, again, there were startups in our space who 3 to 6 months ago, their bet on AI was, you know, okay, we'll let users upload a PDF file and then they can chat to it, or, you know, something along those lines. And again, in 3 to 6 months, now that feature is just built into OpenAI. And now arguably, you know, anyone with access to ChatGPT can deploy that, you know, a custom GPT with its own sort of uploaded files as well. So I think where the risky area is if you're looking at an application of AI that, you know, people talk about wrappers, et cetera, but I think like it really has to do with like how performant is your particular application of AI right now. I think if it's very performant and very easily performant, then it's quite obvious that it would be quite easy for either OpenAI or other products to quickly subsume that into their core product. But I think if you're if you're working on something which is, the existing technology is not very good at right now, or it's good to a certain extent, but you're really pushing the limits of what's possible. I think every time, there's an improvement in AI, every time, the models get released or get improved, you'll instantly fill up whatever new ceiling is set versus having to gradually improve your existing technology to hit that new ceiling. So that's just been sort of my general sort of
thank you
experience and talking with other YC founders on this. Yeah.
Linda, you want to ask a clarification question? Or comment?
I had another question actually. Will GPT ever be on the phone? Because I've seen Llama run on a phone. Because I'm working on like privacy related use cases.
Yeah, it's where GPT gets deployed is quite interesting because there are a whole bunch of use cases where, again, having to transmit information to GPT via an API and then back is problematic. I've seen some people try and apply sort of, not GPT, but sort of open source models, on the edge, essentially, localized within a particular machine. I know people have tried that, like you said, with open source. I don't know the answers to that. I don't know whether OpenAI ever intends to, allow you to self-deploy. Yeah, but I guess I think maybe the answer would be if there's enough of an opportunity there, I wouldn't bet against OpenAI offering that as some kind of service at some point. And so I probably wouldn't build a company around being able to offer LLMs that are, deployed on a mobile or on-prem, etc. Because I think that's just something that OpenAI could quite easily say, okay, now we offer this and we'll do it for, I don't know, whatever pricing. So, yeah.
So Randeep is asking, are you using the Python code generation execution feature yet?
Yeah, so we have experimented with, the output of GPT. So right now we have a run code component, and we have the ability for you to say, okay, I need this code component to transform all values in this list into a HTML output, and each value is a separate paragraph. And we have experimented and actually do use AI to actually perform that particular task. So yeah, we have used the Python generation capability of the core model. We haven't experimented with actually bringing in the Python generation capability of the new assistance API into the platform yet. Again, I think there's still some experimentation around this, but it is quite interesting. Yes, the implications of this around, again, low code, no code, I think, like you sort of mentioned there, is quite significant, because I think the barrier to actually writing code to achieve something that you need is significantly decreased. And one of the disadvantages of no code, low code is definitely that, those edge cases, going to a visual programming language or interface, you do lose a lot of control. You lose a lot of capability around the edges. And I think one of the interesting things is, again, if you can bring AI to actually write the code itself, do you really need, visual drag and drop at all at this point? But yeah, so we have experimented with it, but it is quite interesting. Yeah. And yeah, exactly like you said, the more you abstract, the more, you actually lose along the way. I don't know whether we'll get, at what point we'll get to you just being able to describe, I need to do X, Y, Z, and, the AI just writes an entire fully functional code base for you. I think the key limitation with that at the moment is, the AI is very good at writing, code from scratch. A lot of the code editors still haven't nailed down what I would call, the edit or the iteration, right? So it's written you the code, and then you say, okay, I need these changes made to it, or, I need these changes made to it a week later after you've gone in and made your own changes. A lot of the code generators haven't, developed that ability to sync in with the current state of everything that you have, and then go back and go, okay, here are the changes which I would suggest into it. So it's kind of that thing where I think right now you can ask AI to do X and it'll give you the output, but its ability to then resync after you've gone into that output, made your own changes, I think is probably what we don't really see at this moment. Yeah.
Cool, thank you. So we have 3 minutes left, Aaron. So two things. One is anything else we should know before we wrap up? Two, can any of these folks who are joining today reach out to you for any advice, feedback, interesting comments, or what are good next steps here?
Yeah, so I guess the probably, the key thing is just to, I think for me, it's been about the evolution of the outputs of AI. With 12 months ago, we were primarily looking at completions. So you give the AI something, it gives you a response back. 6 months ago, it really evolved into a chat. So, you give it a message, it sends it back and forward, you have that chat. 3 months ago, AI started being able to produce, or at least, ChatGPT being able to produce, files, images, run code, etc. And now with the Assistance API, and I think with all the work around agents, you will really see that the core output of AI being not so much just, content or an output, but actually actions or a set of actions or, a plan that then is in turn executed by other agents. So I think it will be quite interesting to see, I think what you see here is just AI evolving and becoming more and more human, I guess, in a way, in terms of like how it can actually achieve a given objective or task. In terms of, yes, happy to answer questions, happy to talk about our experience with implementing AI, share some sort of insights that we've had, some mistakes we've made, some I think good decisions that we've made, etc. We are hiring for people who are sort of very actively interested in this space, and in particular for people interested in applying generative AI into the workflow automation, business process automation space. So if you are interested, just reach out to me and let me know. But yeah, hopefully that was helpful.
Cool. In terms of the jobs, are you hiring remotely? Are you hiring in Australia? Are you hiring in San Francisco?
Yeah, so I think for our AI related roles, we'd really want to focus, primarily on the Bay Area, but potentially open to anyone in the US. Like Chris mentioned, I'll be based out of, the Bay Area. And I think that's very deliberate. I guess the other takeaway is I do think that, if you are in the AI space, there is a massive advantage to being in the Bay. And you see it when you're in the Bay and when you're not in the Bay. And I think it's just a whole confluence of things. It's, the people that you talk to, the interactions that you have, it's how quickly you sort of hear about the latest technologies or techniques. And particularly in sort of the environment that we've seen in the last 3 to 6 months, knowing something 2 weeks, a month, a couple of weeks ahead of everyone else has, it could accumulate over time into quite a significant advantage. Being able to just chat with people, again, understanding what worked for them, what didn't work for them, etc. So that's just a bit of background, I guess, why like I said, for the AI role, optimally in the Bay, but open to the right candidate outside of the Bay and in the US more generally.
Awesome. On that note, Aaron, thanks so much for taking time out of your busy day to educate all of us of all the OpenAI's latest announcements and going deeper here. And everyone, thanks for joining this meetup and discussion. Appreciate all your help.
Awesome. No, thanks for hosting, Chris.
Bye-bye.